talked about, why you can do this, and we've talked about how you should set goals so that you know what you're doing. And so this last talk I wanted to talk about is what causes homeschools to fail. Because there are a number of them that fail. And they don't fail in the sense of that they don't teach their children, because the reality is the standard set by the public school is pretty low. They usually fail for other reasons. And by fail, I mean they stop before they reach the point where they've graduated the students from school, where they say, we don't want to do this anymore. And obviously the first reason that homeschools fail is this takes real commitment. And I started out, or in the last session, I talked about you have to set goals for your children. You have to say, this is what I want my children to be when they're 40 or 50. And when you homeschool, you have to ask yourself that question first. Am I willing to give up things for the sake of my children? Because we talked about how hard it is to homeschool if you have a husband and a wife that both work. That makes it very difficult to homeschool. And that either means that your schedule with each other will be cut back, or one of you will have to cut back the hours that you work. There will have to be sacrifices made. But you have to ask yourself, are those sacrifices worth it or not? Are you willing to say, we'll go with less material things so that our children will be better prepared for their lives? Are we willing to spend less time seeking our pleasure and actually doing things that are work? It's work to say, this is the curriculum that you should use. It's work to go to your children every day and say, have you read this chapter of the book? What did it mean? And these things don't have to take a whole lot of time. The reality is, once you get the child so that they can read and learn by themselves, most of what you need to do is just go, did you do it? But that still takes real effort. It still takes a real desire to be a blessing to your children so that you will tell them, no, you can't go do that. You haven't finished your work yet. And when they try to slip by and pretend like they did their work when they didn't really do their work, you need to go, but wait a second, you skipped question 2, 3, and 4. You need to go back and fill these in. And so one of the basic ways that homeschools fail is that the parents aren't starting out with a commitment to finish. It's not free. As Charles said in the answer to one of the questions, is that one of the things you have to teach your children is to gain knowledge. There is a cost to gain knowledge. If all it is walking and asking the father, but then the father has to go Google it for 15 minutes, that was a real cost. But that's going to be true for your homeschool. When you homeschool, you have to be willing to say, I will put aside other things because I care about my children and think this is necessary for them, and I'm willing to put aside my desires for other desires of mine, which is for the blessing of my children. So one of the things that happens is that you enter in without your eyes wide open. Enter into homeschooling with your eyes wide open. If you structure it right, if you take the time right, it doesn't need to be that much work, but it's day after day after day after day. And there's great joys with it, because you can actually accomplish more. I mean, the question that they asked Andrea was, or that Andrea answered, which is, how do you get your work done while you're trying to homeschool? Well, the point comes that if you've trained your children right, they do more than the mother did. We have a lot fancier meals now than we ever did when Kendra cooked. No offense to her cooking. But Rachel's much more into cooking than her mother is. And so the meals are far more precise and far more, not fancier in that sense, because I don't really like fancy food, but they're a lot more carefully made, and there's a lot more effort put into them. And so, with my sons, we built a 2,800 square foot building and then turned around and built his house, which is more square feet than I can count. But if you look at your children, you can also say we can exceed the work we can do if we can have the patience to do this and persevere for 8, 10 years to the point where together as a family you can produce a lot more than you did to begin with. But you have to have that commitment to persevere through that. And you have to have the commitment to say the delayed gratification is worth it, because it is delayed gratification. And we're not a society that's very good at delayed gratification. But for your homeschool to be successful, you have to say, it's worth it to see my grandchildren in a certain environment. It's worth it for the increased productivity that I can do with my children. It's worth it to do this work for 10 years before I get what I see as a major return. Another reason that homeschools fail is that they have the wrong expectation. And what I mean by that is, if you expect to accomplish everything that a public school accomplishes, you're almost certainly going to fail. Your house, your household, your home cannot produce a football team. And the football team from a public school they spend 3 hours a day for 5 months for football. You're not going to be able to do that at home. If you think that your homeschool, if you set expectations for it where you just say, I'm going to do exactly what the public schools did and I'm going to accomplish as much as the public schools, I would argue you set the wrong goals. But if you have those expectations, you should not expect to meet them. It's very easy to exceed public schools in certain ways, but it's hard to exceed them in other ways. It's hard to exceed them in terms of, I'd say misbehavior. It's hard to exceed them. But it's also hard to exceed them in terms of sports. It's hard to exceed them in terms of the number of options that are available to your children in a lot of ways, that there can be lots of different electives that would be hard for you to do. So if your expectation is, I have to reproduce everything that's in the public school, you're going to end up thinking that your private school, your homeschool, was a failure. Another way that is one of the things that I've seen time after time after time is the people that have the most trouble homeschooling are the ones that were trained to be teachers. Because when they're trained to be teachers, most of the training of teaching, even though they don't necessarily say this in normal schools and schools that are to teach teachers, most of what they're doing is crowd control. And so they structure how you teach to do crowd control. They structure how you teach to keep a group of children in line so that you can teach them something. And so if you take that and you bring that and you put that into your household, it's not going to work very well. And the teachers who go, well, you should do these workbooks and you should do this exact scope and sequence that the public schools do. If you try to do that and teach the same way as the public schools teach, they are structured for a specific environment because of the advantages of that environment or the disadvantages of that environment. And so your homeschool needs to be about the goal and not about the process. Most homeschooling that I see struggle the most is because they just say, we're going to take the process, we're going to public school in our home. Public schooling in your home doesn't work. As we've talked about on the various Q&A sessions, a lot of the teaching takes place in the midst of life. It takes place at the grocery store. It takes place when you have them help you do dishes or you make them do dishes. As you clean, as you do these normal things that are part of life, as you do these things, you should take the time to say the goal isn't just to go, can I get this recipe made? It's, let's practice multiplying by 2. Every single thing on this recipe, tell me what it is if I double the recipe. That's math. But that's not what public schools do. So if all you do is teach public schools like math teach it, it's not how you actually use math. And it's going to be ineffective. It's going to be frustrating. And it's going to feel useless in a lot of ways. And that can get people to go, I just can't do this. Because they're trying to do something they shouldn't be doing. What you should be doing is saying, how do I get this information? How do I get this skill set? How do I get these character qualities into my children? Not how do I do what public school does. Public school is dealing with a completely different environment than your home. But all this does come down to, I've said this multiple times before, which is a large part of the effort in public schools is to constrain the children. A large part of the effort in private schools, in homeschools, has to be to constrain the children. If you can teach your children to obey, then everything else is easy to teach. If you don't teach your children to obey, nothing else will be easy to teach. And it looks very different when you look at a homeschool about how you teach the children to obey, because you have different tools, you have different ways to punish, you have even the emotional connection with the parent means that you can do other things to instruct them, to constrain them, to direct them. You can use the rod like the Bible says to do. You can do these things that the public school doesn't do, but if all you're doing is taking public school and doing it at home, you're going to find that you're trying to teach your children obedience without the peer pressure, which is a big part of how they do obedience in public school, is that you don't obey because you don't want all the other children to be looking at you. You don't disobey. And so when you think about this, you need to say, how am I going to get my children to obey? And you need to be willing to do the difficult things to get your child to obey. And understand, you can look and you can say, okay, in first grade, they're supposed to learn how to read, which a lot don't, but that's technically what's supposed to be learned in first grade primarily, is how to read. But if you spend that same year and all you do is teach them to obey, you've made far greater progress in their education than you will if you teach them to read. Because if they learn to obey, then every one of the 11 years following, you'll get at least 3 or 4 times more out of them than you would have if they disobeyed and knew how to read. So part of it has to be that you're willing to step back and say, I'm not just reproducing public school. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say, these are the important things, and make sure those things are taught. And specifically, controlling your child. And if you say, oh no, my child's perfect, I just have to let him do whatever his will says to do. You taught him his will. He does have a will to rebel, but these people who think that there's all these things that are out in the world where people are just going, everybody has to be allowed to do what they think is right. No, they don't. They were taught what is right. They were taught this is good, this is bad. And so you need to be willing to teach them those things, and you need to be willing to teach them the hard things. And the hardest is you have to do what I say. But if you make it about, I'm just going to let them do whatever they want, understand you're going to be miserable. Because what they want to do is they want power over you. And if you give them power over you, they will use it on you, and you will be miserable. Because their will now becomes what directs the household rather than your will. In the homeschooling, instead of being a time of bonding with your children, instead of being a time of enjoying doing things together, it will become a time of misery because your child's just trying to manipulate and control you. That's the first thing you have to teach them, is to obey. Another thing that causes children to, or homeschools to fail, is actually boredom. It's actually not challenging your children enough. Because the reality is, this would also cause a lot of public schools to fail. But in public school, you're stuck, so you end up going anyway. And the teacher doesn't have to listen to you all day going, oh, what should I do now? I'm so bored. It's really important that you challenge your children. And again, to go back to the recommendations on the Department of Non-Public Education thing, is that you should match the scope and sequence, that you should try to match public school. You need to be doing more than that, or your children will get bored. Because public school is designed to go at the lowest common denominator. And going at the lowest common denominator means most of the children are bored most of the time. And so one of the most important things seems to be contrary to it, but one of the most important things to have a successful homeschool is to make sure that you're constantly challenging your children. You know, the Bible says the glory of youth is its strength. If you're not using that strength, they'll use it for something else. And part of what they'll use it for is, I'm so bored, let me out of here. And so it's very important that we deal with boredom, that we look and we say, here's skills that my children have. How am I going to use those skills? And what I said back to the first one is, they fail because of lack of commitment. Not because you have to spend a lot of time, but you have to spend a lot of energy and a lot of thought. What should my children be doing? This child that I have, his gifts are obvious. You know your child. But now you know his gifts. What are you going to do about it? That takes really work to think about, to consider, to say, this is what I should be doing in order for my child to not be bored, but instead to grow in the areas that he's most gifted in and what he's strongest in. Another way that they fail is people ignore opportunities all the time. There are so many opportunities out there, and it's easy for us to get caught up and go, well, I just don't know how to do science. Oh, well, I'll put them back in public school. There's plenty of websites that teach all the science stuff. There's plenty of places where there's other homeschool parents that have the facilities, that bought the microscopes, that do all these things, that have the things that you need. But instead of going, I wonder if there's somebody I can borrow a microscope from so that my child who's interested in biology can learn more about biology, they just go, well, the public school has a bunch of them. Or languages. There's lots of people around that would love to help your child learn a language. There's Duolingo. There's stuff on the internet that you can use to learn languages. But if instead of seizing the opportunities, if you instead just ignore the opportunities, if you ignore the opportunities that are out there, then in the end what you'll do is you'll go, oh, we failed to do this and this and this. Not because it's not possible to do, but because you haven't looked at it enough to say, this is what I should be doing. Excuse me. And actually the last one that I have that causes homeschools to fail is overlooking failure. And what I mean by that is, it's very easy when your child is writing to go, well, he doesn't write well, so I'm just going to say that's okay. Or, yeah, he did all those math problems and he got the answer wrong on 90% of them, but I don't want to hurt his feelings and tell him that he's lousy at math and that he needs to go back and do it again. And just overlooking failure and just saying it's okay. And this is a big problem in homeschool, especially as I said before, the assignment is due at 3 o'clock on Wednesday. And at 3:30, they bring the assignment and you go, well, that's good enough. Well, no, you're overlooking their failure. You're teaching them that it's acceptable to fail. And when they get out in the world, the real world doesn't overlook failure like that. And so we need to make sure when we're teaching our children that we're realistic. We're realistic about what they know. We're realistic about whether they did the things that they were supposed to do. And this is a constant challenge. This is why I said, after they reach a certain level, the majority of the work is to say, did you really do it? Did you really study that? Do you really know the material? Tell me what this meant. It's not to go teach them, it's to verify and validate that they were taught. And when they fail, to be willing to go, you failed, you need to go do this right. And have an expectation that they can go back and do it right. And this is a problem that mothers tend to have more than fathers, of just going, well, he really tried, so I'll just move on. No, don't overlook their failures. Make sure you say, nope, that's not acceptable, go do it again. And again, the real things that will determine whether they're successful in life is not how they did on a history test about the Reconstruction. It's about whether they did the work that they were told to do. It's whether they were obedient and willing and they strove to do it. The testing isn't about that knowledge, because almost everybody in this room forgets that knowledge that they had a test on. It's to teach them that you have to do things when you're told to do them. It's to teach them you have to put forth an effort. And if all you do when they fail is just to go, oh, well, you tried at least. I understand that's why our public schools are getting worse and worse so rapidly. But understand your school won't be successful unless you're willing to say to your child, you failed, go do it again. So as we think of the things that set you up for failure, it really is saying, I have goals, and I want to do the work to achieve the goals, and I'm willing to do the work to achieve the goals, and I'm willing to hold accountable to achieve the goals. And if you do this, homeschooling is not that hard, if you can constrain your child. But if you don't, you're just setting yourself up for failure.